December 20th, 1944. The snow falls in thick, silent sheets over the dense Ardennes forest near Bastogne, Belgium. The temperature has plunged below freezing, and the once green ridges are now coated in a pale shroud of ice and death. In the distance, the echo of artillery rolls across the valley, low, thunderous, unrelenting. It's 0430 hours, and Private First Class Harold Harry Shaw Jr. grips his frozen M1 rifle so tightly that the steel burns his palms. The men of the 283rd Field Artillery Battalion have been awake for 36 hours. Their breath clouds the air like smoke from dying engines. Somewhere beyond the tree line, the German armor is moving again. The earth trembles. US Army After Action Report, DEC 1944. Bastogne has become a trap. What began as a routine forward advance has turned into chaos. A sudden counter-offensive so vast and violent that even the veterans call it the nightmare. Hitler's last gamble. The men didn't know it yet, but this would be the largest battle ever fought by the United States Army. For Harry, it was not a campaign anymore. It was survival. The day before, their convoy had been cut off by a tide of German panzers punching through the thin American lines. Trucks burned in the snow. Communications failed. The 283rd, trained to provide long-range fire support, was now scattered, isolated, and surrounded. Radios crackled only with static. Command posts vanished. And still, headquarters demanded they hold the line. Signal Corps Dispatch, DEC 1944. Harry had seen the first shells fall around dusk. The horizon flared orange. Trees split apart. Horses screamed. In the confusion, he and a dozen men scrambled into a drainage ditch, clutching their rifles against the mud. "They're everywhere," someone whispered. "They're coming right through us!" Then came the rumble. Treads grinding ice, engines roaring like beasts in the dark. German King Tigers, 70 tons of black steel rolling over the frozen fields toward them. Bundesarchiv, 506th Heavy Panzer Battalion log. The men could do nothing but wait. Each breath felt like glass in their lungs. A single move, a single sound could draw fire. Harry stared up through the fog, and for a moment he thought he saw the stars blinking behind the drifting smoke. Then a voice broke over the radio, a desperate, broken signal. "All units, hold position. Do not withdraw. Repeat, do not..." Then silence. When dawn came, the snow was red. The air stank of oil and blood. Harry's unit had ceased to exist as an organized force. Half the battalion lay dead or missing. The others, scattered in pockets across the woods, were fighting for their lives. He stumbled through the wreckage, calling for anyone who could answer. A sergeant he barely knew shouted that the road to Foy was cut off. The enemy had circled them completely. "We're trapped," he said flatly. "They've got armor on every road." US Army Debrief, Feb 1945. By midday, the shelling resumed, closer this time. The Germans were tightening their noose. Harry took cover behind the remains of a shattered truck, hands trembling as he loaded fresh clips into his rifle. The steel felt too heavy, his vision too narrow. Every instinct told him to run. But where? Behind them, more enemy columns were converging. Ahead lay nothing but forest and white emptiness. To his left, a young corporal, barely 19, broke down completely. "We're finished," he sobbed. "They've got us boxed in." Harry looked at him, something snapping inside. "No one's finished," he said, voice low, hard. "Not yet." Personal testimony, 283rd Survivor interview, 1947. The day dragged on in bursts of terror and stillness. Allied air support was grounded by snowstorms. No planes, no supplies, no escape. Rumours spread that the 101st Airborne was fighting somewhere near Bastogne, but no one knew where the line truly stood. The Germans kept advancing, shouting orders in the distance, their boots crunching over ice. When night fell again, Harry and 3 survivors took shelter in a collapsed farmhouse on the outskirts of Noville. The roof had been torn apart by artillery. Through the broken rafters, they could see flares rising, red, green, white, signals of advancing enemy units. "If they find us here, we're done," said one man. Harry nodded, jaw clenched. He pulled his coat tighter and stared at the door, rifle across his knees. Outside, the wind screamed through the ruins like a ghost. Local civilian diary, Noville, DEC, 1944 hours passed. Then, in the early morning haze, came the sound of engines. American trucks crawling out of the fog, reinforcements. Harry's heart leapt. But as they drew closer, he saw the iron crosses painted on their hulls. German half-tracks. They were wearing stolen Allied markings. The men opened fire. The fight was short, brutal, deafening. Muzzle flashes lit the snow like lightning. One German fell, then another. The others returned fire with machine guns cutting through the farmhouse walls. Splinters and dust filled the air. Harry ducked behind a beam, his ears ringing, his breath ragged. When the gunfire stopped, only silence remained. He turned and saw that 2 of his men were gone. Just gone. U.S. Graves Registration Service, record number 4428. Alone, Harry stumbled into the woods, following no path, guided only by instinct. The snow came heavier now, blurring everything into a white oblivion. He walked for hours, delirious, hungry, clutching his rifle like a lifeline. Once he thought he heard English voices, shouts of "Over here!" But when he reached the clearing, it was empty except for the wreck of a Sherman tank half buried in snow. Its crew lay frozen beside it, faces grey and unblinking. Army Photographic Unit, Ardennes Roll, 51. That night, he found shelter in a barn near a deserted village. The cattle inside had been slaughtered, their carcasses stiff with frost. He sat in the dark, listening to distant artillery, feeling the war close in from all sides. Somewhere out there, men like him were fighting, freezing, dying. Somewhere, perhaps, his battalion still existed. But in that moment, it felt like the world had forgotten him. By the 3rd day, Harry's rations were gone. He scavenged frozen bread from a wrecked German truck and melted snow in his helmet to drink. Each sunrise brought the same grim horizon. White, endless, silent. But then, as he crested a ridge overlooking a narrow valley, he saw movement below. Columns of smoke, trucks, men digging trenches, American helmets. He nearly wept. Salvation, or so he thought. Crawling closer through the snow, he realized too late that the uniforms were wrong. Field grey. Germans again. He froze in place, heart hammering. A patrol passed within 20 feet of him. One soldier laughed, tossing a cigarette into the snow. Harry didn't breathe until they vanished into the trees. German patrol log, 116th Panzer Division. As darkness fell for the 4th time, Harry lay buried beneath snow and straw in a roadside ditch, praying for dawn. His mind drifted between memories of home and the sound of distant guns. He thought of Carlo, the friend who had helped him enlist, of Dothan's tar paper barracks, of Utah Beach, St. Lo, and the faces that were gone forever. And he thought, absurdly, of escape. But how could one man escape a battlefield already swallowed by the enemy? How could he slip past entire divisions armed with tanks, dogs, and floodlights? In the frozen heart of Europe, in a war that had consumed millions, it seemed impossible. Yet, as the wind howled over the Ardennes that night, Harold Harry Shaw Jr. was not finished. Somewhere, through the dark and the snow, the first spark of an idea flickered. A reckless, desperate plan that would turn a hopeless battle into one of the most unbelievable escapes of World War II. U.S. Army Oral History Collection, Tape 19B. The morning of December 24th, 1944, dawned with a sky the colour of gunmetal. The snow had stopped, but the cold was sharper than ever, -15 degrees and falling. Harry Shaw crouched in the shadows of a ruined chapel on the outskirts of Foy, listening to the muffled thump of artillery echoing from Bastogne. Every breath hung in the air like smoke. He was weak, frostbitten, and alone. His unit destroyed, his radio gone, his hope hanging by a thread. But he was alive, and he was about to attempt something no one believed possible. U.S. Army After Action Report, 283rd Field Artillery, Deck, 1944. 2 days earlier, during a brief lull between bombardments, Harry had scavenged the remains of a German courier truck struck by American fire. Among the debris, he found what would become his salvation: a Wehrmacht winter coat, a map smeared with blood, and a half-burned stack of field orders marked Kampfgruppe Piper. The insignia told him what he needed to know. This was one of Hitler's elite armoured spearheads, the same that had carved through the Ardennes with brutal precision. Bundesarchive, Piper Unit Log, Deck 1944. Hidden in the lining of the coat, he discovered a folded pass, an Ausweis, granting the bearer movement authorization between frontline positions. The ink had run from melted snow, but the stamp was still visible. It was enough. Enough to bluff. Enough to survive. Harry had grown up around German immigrants in Ohio. He spoke broken phrases, enough to mimic a nervous foot soldier. And now, in the middle of a war-torn forest, those half-remembered words might save his life. Intelligence Briefing, U.S. 12th Army Group, Jan 1945. He began his escape disguised as the enemy, with the stolen coat buttoned to his chin, rifle slung backward, and helmet pulled low. He walked the snow-covered road toward the east. Every step was a gamble. German patrols moved constantly, checking identification, hauling in stragglers. Once, an officer on a motorcycle stopped beside him, barking a question. Harry froze. Then, recalling a phrase he'd overheard from prisoners, he muttered, "Befehl von oben," orders from above. The officer frowned, grunted, and drove off. Captured German radio log, 1st SS Panzer, Deck, 1944. By dusk, he'd crossed nearly 4 miles of enemy-held territory. What saved him wasn't luck. It was the chaos. The German offensive, though massive, was already faltering under its own weight. Fuel shortages, broken supply lines, and relentless Allied artillery had begun to choke the advance. Columns moved blindly through the forest, often without coordination. A lone figure in a winter coat drew little notice amid the confusion. US Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. But Harry's survival wasn't just courage, it was technical ingenuity. He scavenged parts from broken vehicles, a canteen from a destroyed Panzer IV, dry rations from an abandoned Kubelwagen, even a field compass whose needle quivered, but still pointed roughly west. The German engineering fascinated him. The precision gears, the meticulous labeling. They built everything like a clock, he later recalled. But the clock was running out. Technical Manual TME 30451, 1944. By Christmas Eve, his boots were torn, and frostbite had numbed his fingers. He could no longer feel the trigger of his rifle. He followed the map by moonlight, aiming to reach the Our River, the natural boundary between German and Allied lines. But the river valley was crawling with troops. Machine gun nests overlooked every bridge. He knew he'd never make it across by day. So, he waited. That night, the temperature plummeted further. Harry slipped down the embankment toward the frozen water. Somewhere upriver he heard singing, soft, low, human, a Christmas hymn. Stille Nacht. The Germans were celebrating. He used their song as cover, crawling onto the ice, inch by inch. The surface groaned but held. Midway across, a flare burst overhead, bathing the river in blinding light. He froze. For 5 eternal seconds he was a figure on white glass. Then the flare dimmed, and the night swallowed him again. Combat Intelligence Report, 9th Army, Deck, 1944. Reaching the western bank, he collapsed in exhaustion. The sounds of war seemed to fade behind him. But the nightmare wasn't over. Ahead lay a minefield, rows of frozen stakes and warning signs half buried in snow. He could see no safe path. Then, through the haze, he noticed something faintly glowing beneath the drifts. A broken wooden sled, half covered in powder. Its tracks led forward, weaving through the danger zone. He followed them step by step, placing his feet exactly where the sled had once rolled. Engineer Corps Report, 112th Battalion, Jan, 1945. At dawn, he reached a cluster of pine trees overlooking a field strewn with burned-out Shermans. American tanks. The line was close, but the distance between him and freedom was still more than a mile of open ground. He could hear German voices behind him, patrols searching the woods. He was running out of time. In a final act of desperation, Harry built a decoy. Using branches, his coat, and a torn tarp, he fashioned a crude silhouette in the snow, a false body facing east. Then, circling wide under cover of smoke from a burning vehicle, he sprinted for the tree line. Bullets hissed through the air, but he didn't stop. One grazed his shoulder, spinning him around. He hit the ground, crawled forward, blood freezing on his sleeve. Medical report, 283rd Field Artillery, Feb 1945. At the far edge of the clearing, he stumbled into an abandoned American command post. The walls were riddled with bullet holes, radios shattered, but one set still flickered faintly. A Signal Corps SCR 300 field radio, its antenna bent, batteries dying. He rewired the leads with frozen fingers, cursing under his breath. Then he keyed the transmitter. This is Shaw, 283rd Field Artillery, friendlies trapped near Foy. Anyone copy? Static. Then faintly a voice. Identify. Authentication code. Harry didn't know the code. He paused, heart pounding, then remembered something. Each unit's Christmas ration tins had been marked with a serial number. He gave his ration 283C and prayed. There was a long silence. Then came the reply. Copy Shaw, hold position. Help inbound. Signal Corps Archive, Jan, 1945. For 6 agonizing hours, He waited in that ruin, gunfire echoing through the forest. His wound throbbed. His breath came shallow. Then, near dusk, he heard it, the distant rumble of engines. Not German this time. Deep, guttural, rhythmic, the sound of M4 Shermans. American armor. From the smoke emerged the white star of the US Army. A squad from the 42nd Infantry Division had intercepted his transmission. They had been combing the area for survivors, unaware that a lone artilleryman had crossed enemy lines on foot. When they found him, he was half-conscious, leaning against the broken radio, whispering, "You took your time." 42nd Infantry Division report. Deck 1944. Back at the field hospital in Bastogne, doctors were stunned. Frostbite, shrapnel wounds, dehydration. By every metric, he shouldn't have survived. Yet Harry Shaw had not only lived, but had crossed nearly 15 miles of hostile territory during one of the fiercest battles of the war. Word of his escape spread through the ranks like wildfire. To some, it was a miracle. To others, a testament to American grit. To Harry, it was just duty. "I wasn't supposed to die there," he said later. "Not while there was still a road home." Veteran Oral History, 1963. But the full truth of his escape went deeper than heroism. His survival symbolized something larger, the turning tide of the war. The same battle that had nearly destroyed the Allied line now revealed the fragility of Hitler's last gamble. And one soldier's desperate flight through the snow would soon become a metaphor for an entire army clawing its way from despair toward victory. The war was not over yet, but the momentum had shifted. And as 1945 dawned over a shattered Europe, the story of Harry Shaw's escape was only beginning to echo through the ranks, whispered among men who had learned that courage could outlast even the coldest winter of war. When dawn broke over the Ardennes on January 1st, 1945, the snow was no longer white. It was grey with ash, littered with the remnants of tanks, helmets, and the frozen silhouettes of men who never made it home. The Battle of the Bulge was ending, not with triumph, but with exhaustion. For every mile reclaimed, blood had paid the price. The Allies had lost nearly 90,000 men, killed, wounded, or missing. The Germans, over 100,000. But amid the smouldering ruins, stories began to surface. Stories like that of Private First Class Harold Harry Shaw Jr., the artilleryman who had defied death and walked out of hell. US Army Casualty Report, Jan 1945. Harry's tale spread quickly through the 283rd Field Artillery Battalion, which was slowly reforming after weeks of chaos. In canteens and mess tents, his name was whispered as the man who escaped the impossible. Officers referenced his survival in after-action briefings, not as myth but as morale, a reminder that endurance could still outmatch despair. For men who had watched friends vanish under snow and steel, his story was proof that fate could be challenged. 283rd Battalion Command Memo, Jan 1945. But even as the battalion regrouped, the war pressed on. The German offensive had failed, yet the cost of victory was staggering. Supply lines stretched to breaking, artillery barrels were worn thin from constant fire. Engineers in the rear, mechanics, welders, logisticians, worked around the clock to restore the battered machinery of war. In field depots near Liège, young factory workers from Detroit and Pittsburgh rebuilt gun carriages under floodlights, their hands numb from cold. "Every shell we reloaded, we thought of the boys still out there," wrote technician Ellen Gardner, one of the many women maintaining the artillery flow. War Department Production Report, Jan 1945. As the Allies regained their momentum, Harry's experience became more than a survival story. It became a symbol of adaptation. His use of enemy equipment, his disguise, his rewire of the SCR 300 radio, all reflected the improvisation that had become the American hallmark of 1944-45. The war had transformed ordinary men into engineers, field mechanics, and inventors. In an era when every resource mattered, ingenuity was a weapon as decisive as any rifle. US Signal Corps Analysis, 1945. In late January, Harry was reassigned to Bastogne's recovery unit. The city, once a fortress of resistance, now stood shattered, brick by brick, wall by wall. Civilians wandered through the ruins searching for family. Children played among burned-out trucks. Harry helped clear debris and identify remains from the snow. One afternoon, he found a fragment of a dog tag lodged in the ice. Carlo's name was etched faintly on the metal. He stared at it for a long time before tucking it into his pocket. "That was the day I realized I didn't really escape," he said later. "Part of me was still there." Personal memoir, 1952. As Allied forces pushed toward the Rhine, the broader meaning of survival became clear. Germany was collapsing, its cities burning under relentless bombing. Soldiers on both sides had stopped believing in slogans. Letters recovered from captured Germans spoke not of victory, but of longing. "We only want to go home," one wrote in shaky ink. Intercepted field letter, Wehrmacht archives, Feb 1945. Harry's own health deteriorated. Frostbite had claimed 2 toes. His lungs were scarred from exposure and nightmares stalked his sleep. Yet he refused evacuation until April, insisting he owed it to the dead to see it through. When Dachau was liberated later that month, he was there, driving an ammunition truck under a pale spring sun. Nothing could have prepared him for what he saw. Emaciated figures behind barbed wire, the air thick with the stench of death, ashes still warm in the crematoria. That was when the war stopped being about nations, he would say years later. It became about humanity. US Army Liberation Report, April 1945. After Germany's surrender in May, the men of the 283rd were sent home in waves. The victory parades in New York and Boston were jubilant, but for many veterans, the noise felt hollow. Harry returned to Ohio in February 1946, stepping off the bus in the early morning cold. His father didn't recognize his voice on the phone at first. His brother drove through the night to meet him at the station. "You're home," was all he said. And for the first time in years, Harry believed it. Veteran Affairs Return Log, Feb 1946. Yet peace was not simple. The battle followed him, in memories, in silence. Like so many veterans, he carried the weight of survival without knowing how to set it down. He avoided crowded rooms. He kept his uniform folded, untouched, in a trunk beneath his bed. Sometimes, when winter came and snow blanketed the fields, he'd pause at the window, staring at the white expanse, seeing not Ohio, but Bastogne. Post-War Psychological Survey, 1950. Still, his legacy endured. In 2016, the French Republic awarded him the Légion d'honneur, honoring his service during the liberation of their homeland. When asked about his medal, Harry smiled faintly. "It's for the ones who didn't make it," he said. French National Archives, Ceremony Transcript, 2016. The story of his escape, once just a soldier's ordeal, became part of a larger narrative of resilience that defined the Allied victory. Military academies later studied his improvisation as a case in survival under extreme conditions. In the early days of the Cold War, his experience informed new field manuals on resistance and evasion, teaching future generations that adaptability could be a weapon as powerful as firepower. US Army Field Manual FM 2176, 1957. Strategically, the Battle of the Bulge reshaped Allied doctrine. The chaos that trapped Harry and thousands like him exposed the fragility of communication networks and the vital role of logistics. Post-war commanders credited the quick repair of radio systems, fuel convoys, and medical lines as decisive in turning the tide. Engineers such as Howard Aiken and Grace Hopper, working in wartime computation, began developing the data systems that would later evolve into Cold War command networks. The seed of modern network-centric warfare was planted in those frozen forests. US Strategic Analysis, 1946. Psychologically, the battle's impact endured far beyond 1945. For the Germans, it was the shattering of the illusion of invincibility. For the Allies, it was the final test of endurance. The Ardennes was the crucible, wrote historian Major David Hart in 1951. It burned away arrogance and left only resolve. Hart, After the Bulge, Lessons in Survival, 1951. For Harry Shaw, it was the moment when the idea of victory changed. Winning, he said, wasn't about flags or maps. It was about making it home, about not giving up when every reason said to. Oral Interview, 1974. As years passed, his story faded quietly into the archives, rediscovered only by historians decades later. Yet the lesson remained timeless. Wars are not only won by generals and strategies, but by the endurance of individuals who refuse to break. Each decision in the snow, each spark of ingenuity, becomes part of a chain that shapes history. On the last page of his wartime journal, written in 1945 and never meant for anyone's eyes, Harry left a single line. When the world went dark, I walked toward the light, even when I couldn't see it. And so, from the frozen silence of Bastogne to the warm applause of homecoming parades, the legacy of one soldier's impossible escape stands as a testament to what survival truly means. In modern war, technology may evolve, tactics may change, but one truth endures: the will to live, to adapt, to endure, to return is the most unbreakable weapon a soldier can ever carry.